I hear rumbling in the background here, so we may get some power outages.
You're gonna, yeah, it's heading your way. It's done here, so it's heading your way.
Was it big?
Yeah, it was actually no lightning, but just a lot of wind and rain. So we need the rain, so that's good.
Yes, yes.
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here looking after my dad, so that's why I'm here.
Hi, Robert.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Robert.
Hi, Robert.
How's everybody doing?
Surviving.
Yeah.
Okay, so who finished reading Ralston's letter?
I did.
Oh,
Oh, yes.
Great
I read it.
I never. It was another page.
Yeah.
Good letter.
It's always a challenge on just before the meeting, the number of things that come in that we try to digest. Especially, I feel sorry for Krista. Okay, the agenda is up on the screen now, so I will get the show on the road. I'd like to call the meeting to order for June 22nd, 2020. As we all know, we're currently broadcasting on Zoom and live streaming on YouTube. Given this meeting is being held electronically, I want to caution that there may be a possibility of technical difficulties, especially with the thunder I hear rumbling in the background. Should there be any disruptions, I would ask everyone to remain patient as we work to fix the issue and resume the meeting as soon as possible. I'd like to start this meeting. For those of you who are watching, we have a new face around the virtual table. Please join me in welcoming our newest member of the Ottawa Police Services Board, Ms. Beverly Johnson. Beverly was appointed by the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario for a 3-year term. She is a community family physician with over 25 years of experience. Bev, welcome aboard.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm humbled to join the Ottawa Police Services Board and serve the Ottawa community and work closely with Police Chief Slowly and the other members of the board.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to have some delegations, and I'm waiting for the, I have to make an adjustment here. Okay, so now I'm going to proceed with the agenda. That the Ottawa Police Services Board confirmed the agenda of the 22nd of June 2020 meeting. Is the agenda confirmed? Are there any dissents? Not hearing any dissents. The next item is the confirmation of minutes. Minutes minutes number 22 of the 25th of May 2020 meeting. That the Ottawa Police Services Board confirmed the minutes number 22 of the 25th of May 2020 meeting. Are the minutes confirmed?
confirmed.
Are there any dissents? The next item, are there any declarations of interest?
None.
Okay, so now we're going to go, we have some public delegations this evening. We have a number of them. And what I'd like is when I call your name and introduce you, I will ask the executive director to unmute you so that you can begin speaking. You'll have 5 minutes to speak, not including any questions the board may ask you following your presentation. If you're speaking to a specific item in the agenda, I will hold your presentation until we get to that item on the agenda. I will begin with the first presenter, Kevin O'Donnell. Could you please start, Kevin?
Yes, thank you for having the time to hear what I'd like to say. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So I'll just jump right into it. Thank you for accepting this item for consideration on your agenda. I'll just largely read the same letter. expand on it a little bit, perhaps. This is the letter I sent to the chair via the executive director. And then I'm happy to take your questions if you have any. So in recent years, a trend has emerged in Canada wherein police services are presenting a more intimidating and some would even feel menacing face to the public by way of how police services are choosing to paint vehicles. This trend is towards darker tones and less visible markings, which do just legitimately feel more intimidating. So my question to this, to the board is, what public policy goal does that choice achieve? It certainly isn't to make it easier for the public to see police officers if they needed one. As such, I'm recommending to the board that you provide direction to the Ottawa Police Service to ensure that this practice does not take root if, even in the board's wisdom right now, the Ottawa Police Service isn't trending in that direction, or depending on your some people in the public eye, how they feel is maybe that trend is already underway at the Ottawa Police Service and it should not continue. And therefore, and through that, begin the process of repainting vehicles in the style of perhaps the Battenberg markings, which is a term I wasn't aware of until I did a little research. And we can just collectively think of, what do police vehicles in the UK and Europe look like? They are extremely high contrast vehicles. There's no guessing, you know what it is. And that's a very intentional choice that police services in Europe made. Battenberg markings were first developed in the mid-1990s in the United Kingdom by the Police Scientific Development Branch at the request of the Association of Chief Police Officers. They were first developed for traffic patrol cars in the UK, and then subsequently, because they were so successful, private organizations and civil emergency service vehicles such as fire trucks and ambulances have also used them since. The goal of that project was to create a painting style for police vehicles that would maximize the vehicle's visibility when stopped in both daylight and under headlights from a minimum distance of 500 meters, and which distinctively mark them as police vehicles. The key objectives given to that task force were to create markings that, and here's just a quick bulleted list, that enhanced officer safety and vehicle visibility when in service to prevent collisions when stopped, which is, I know, a very serious concern for patrol officers when they're stopped on the side of a highway or even a street. Made police vehicles recognizable at a distance of 500 meters. Assisted in high visibility policing for public reassurance and the deterrence of traffic violations. Made police vehicles easily recognizable. These last 2 points are interesting. Were equal cost options to the existing markings. And finally, were acceptable to at least 75% of the staff. So, just in closing, I recommend the board direct the Ottawa Police Service to explain its current policy on vehicle markings, and then subsequently justify why the service has not already optimized the painting program for visibility, trustworthiness, and officer safety. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate your taking the time to come and speak to us. I just want to start off with a couple of questions and perhaps a comment. You mentioned that it was the same cost as the current, that Battenberg program was the same cost as the current. Yet, in a little bit of research I did, one of the concerns that had been raised was what was identified as the high cost of adapting to the new method of marking. So I would be interested if you have some specific evidence, because obviously if in these time, well, in any time, we're always concerned about costs. They always have to be at least taken into the discussion. And I'm sure that the issue of costs will be raised. The other thing I wondered was...
Did you want me to answer the cost question first before we
not
bridge to the
yet,
second?
because I think what I'd like you to do is send us something. I mean, I'm certainly happy if you want to make some answer, but I would like to see something, some evidence that with respect to costs. The other thing I wondered if you knew, these were formerly used in Miami Township in Ohio. And I just wondered if you, and I don't expect you to know the answer, but it would be interesting since there seem to be two examples of their use in North America. It would be interesting to know whether they still use them there, and if not, why not? And the other area that I understand they were used in was in Charleston, South Carolina. So it's, I mean, it's always easier in policing when you can pave the way and make it simpler for people to understand all of the angles on things. So those were my questions. And if you wanted to answer, that's great. Otherwise, we could go on to other members.
Sure. So to the cost question, I don't I don't foresee myself even suggesting that at the snap of a finger, the police service be directed to allocate an entire large line item to repaint all vehicles simultaneously. That's simply just not. It's not a pressing problem necessarily, but I think I'm approaching the board more in if the cost is basically negligible between one painting style and another, especially amortized over a course of a service lifetime of a vehicle, and always in relation to just the price of gas. So if the price of gas represents 98% of the cost of a police service vehicle over its lifetime, I don't think we should get too caught up on the painting style if that painting style does legitimately make the police service more approachable for all members of our community. And I think this is probably very affordable. I, of course, don't have the data. So that's why I structured my request to the board to actually be to direct the police service itself to come up with these answers. They are the experts in all of the costs and things like that. To the second question, is it still used? I'm not certain. It's obviously, I'm taking one step back and going, what is the public policy goal we're trying to achieve? And is that if we have a goal that's already been identified by the painting system, is the painting system we're using now meeting those goals as effectively as other alternatives? Or, and I suspect this is actually the case, the police service really hasn't been given any direction on this from its civilian oversight body. So it's just been carrying on in its own way, and it's an acceptable thing, but let's make it really better. So what is better? I personally think that highly visible, high contrast, no questions asked, that's a police vehicle, which doesn't include any of the intimidating hints that are visible in the appendix I provided, which is really just a news article from a few years ago, which really do contrast. And I think any person could just look at two police vehicles spanning a decade or two between the police services that were identified and just go, you know what? The photos on the left from the past are way more accessible than the ones on the right. The vehicle on the left, I'm willing to approach. The vehicle on the right seems menacing. But I don't want to have the board think that I'm just here saying Battenberg paintings are the best. I'm here at suggestions to the board. What is your view on what the best presentation of the police service is? What is the goal of that presentation style? Is the police service meeting it right now? And what else should you direct them to do to make the service even better for every resident in our community?
That's an excellent point. Certainly appreciate the presentation. I'm going to ask if some of my other fellow board members would like to ask some questions. So I'm not sure which member Nerman, is that you I hear that has a question?
Sandy, that's Robert.
Oh, Robert. Okay, sorry, Robert.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
No problem. Thanks, Kevin, for that. My internet connection was cracking for a bit. I just wanted to ask, was there a specific incident that happened that triggered this suggestion, or is it just kind of something that you would like to see going forward?
So I have a split answer to that. It's something I would like to see going forward, the police service providing a friendly, never intimidating face to the public. The specific incident I have in mind is not actually about the paint color itself of a car. It was one day I was walking down Bank Street during lunch, back when we got to go downtown for work, or at least most of us did. And I was just looking at a police officer who was attending to someone on the street, or their partner was. They were just standing there. And I was just remarking on the presentation of that officer. They were, of course, wearing a vest, big belt, large gun. But the thing that struck me was gloves and wraparound opaque glasses that completely obscured what the officer was doing with their eyes. And I'm a 6'1", 220-pound male, and I'm intimidated by that. And then I just think, how do other people in our community feel when they don't have the privileges that I have of walking down the street, and I never get picked on, really? How do they feel approaching an officer that looks like that? So this is part of a wider dialogue of, does everyone in our community feel safe approaching the police? The answer is no. And I'm currently seized on the painting styles because it's just I feel it's a smaller issue that we can talk about and reason about, and probably all agree that yes, police vehicles should not look intimidating. And that's why I'm bringing this to the board for its consideration, to direct to the police service separately. What are you doing about your police vehicles? Are they meeting a public policy goal? What is that goal if we don't really have one written down? Maybe we should get one, and so forth.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Robert, for that question. Bev Johnson, you have a question?
Yes, I do. And thank you for the presentation.
Welcome.
You know, as the board takes a look at this, I would wonder if it'd be useful to see what the public thinks of the two colors and types of police cars, you know, what their input would be on whether they'd find these more approachable.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I'm using Battenberg markings as the example to help build this narrative of what's more approachable, what do people feel better about in terms of accessing their police services. I don't want to taint is the wrong word, but it's bias the board towards any one particular thing. I think we should have a clear policy, perhaps that is within the board's mandate to say to the police service, we want a style of marking for the police vehicles that ensures the following. And then the board in its wisdom could enumerate what those things are. I would suggest to the board that they are approachable, transparent, high visibility, safety, so forth. And then just have the police service through the chief answer to the board with either, oh, look, there is an existing policy, here it is, we're already good, and we dust our hands and walk away. Or the police service comes back and says, you know what, we haven't really formalized this. We've just been kind of on autopilot about this, but we're gonna go back to the shed, come up with something and bring it back to you. And in that, within that framework, if the board could enumerate to the police service what those goals are, what is the public policy objective, then I think we'd be on the right track.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I would just for your interest note that I have an inquiry outstanding with respect to the other issue you raised, which was the uniforms and the approachability of officers and the wearing of dark glasses and the decision about what uniforms should be made at what events. So what I would suggest that we do is I will incorporate, basically expand my earlier inquiry about the uniform, the attire of the officers to include the markings on the vehicles. And I think that perhaps, and you make a very good point about it, it's a policy discussion that what image do we want to see our service portraying, and trying to get away from the idea of being a force and more of it being a service. And so I will suggest that that going forward, this becomes an issue that the Policy and Governance Committee looks at to better frame it, and then move forward with some policy and discussions that we can then forward to the service for the service's comments. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I don't see any other members of the board with their hands up. Just for the public to understand, only board members can raise their hand, and only people who have registered in advance can speak. So if somebody hasn't registered in advance, they can't speak. Caroline, am I hearing your voice that you want to speak?
Yes, please, Sandy, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, sure, of course.
So Kevin, I had occasion to have some police cruisers on my street in the last 2 weeks, and they were the blue and white vehicles. So I'm just wondering, and I'm not aware, I mean, other than I know that there's some traffic vehicles that are completely black, I'm at a loss to think of what kind of vehicle you were looking at that day. Can you describe it?
In the relation of my personal anecdote, I was talking about a officer's personal uniform, not the actual car.
Oh, not the car.
Not the car. And for this purposes, like I brought this to the board, and if it turns out that the police services already has a policy and I just was simply not aware, and the board views the current policy as meeting the objectives, then I'm happy, because that means we've stopped the trend, at least in Ottawa. The appendix I provided showed other major cities in Canada definitely trending towards more menacing vehicles. And if the outcome is the board has made it clear to the service that the Ottawa Police Service should not trend that way, then mission achieved. Yeah.
So Kevin,
I apologize.
That's okay.
I must have missed something. My connection isn't great here, but thank you for that. Okay.
And just one thing because I made a comment about an officer's uniform. I just wanted to clarify. So my father was a police service member in the Ottawa Police for a long time, and officers, since we're on the adjacent topic of how they dress, I don't see officers in public who look like what my dad looked like when he stopped by for lunch on shift. But sorry, I don't want to expand the scope of what I came here to say.
So Kevin, I think you've raised the question that we need to answer, and that is, what is our policy with respect to
Yes.
uniforms and vehicles? That's an
Okay.
excellent question. I think we can look into that. I'll ask again because I didn't see Carol Ann's hand. And is there any other member of the board that wishes to ask Mr. O'Donnell any further questions? I'm not hearing any, so I wanted to thank you again for coming before us, taking the time and bringing this issue to our attention.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next public delegation that we have listed to speak is, I'm just going to go to my screen here, Faraya Ahmed, who is the chair of the Justice for Abdir Rahman Coalition, and Robin Brown. And Robin Brown, I have to apologize. I think on one of the versions of the agenda, your name was misspelled, but that has now been corrected. And Robin is from the UN Persons for African Descent Push Coalition. So I'll turn the floor over to you now. Whichever of you wishes to go first, the floor is yours.
Actually, we should both be unmuted at the same time. We have can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Robin, I hear you. So I can go ahead?
Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
please.
All right, thank you. My name is Farhia Ahmed of the Justice for Abdurrahman Coalition. And I'm joined, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I'm Robin Brown. I'm actually with the 613-819 Black Hub.
Okay.
Okay. I can't begin my portion of the presentation today without acknowledging the tragic death of Mr. Ijaz Chaudhry, a 62-year-old man experiencing a mental health crisis and was killed by Peel Regional Police in paramilitary fashion. Before you dismiss his death as maybe an issue that doesn't affect your jurisdiction, let me quickly remind you of Abdurrahman Abdi. He was a 37-year-old Black man who was experiencing a mental health crisis and who died at the hands of an Ottawa police officer. That officer was Daniel Monsian, and he was subsequently charged with manslaughter, aggravated assault, and assault with a weapon in connection to Abdurrahman's death. The extrajudicial killings of Black, Indigenous, and people of color at the hands of police has become a pandemic. This pandemic requires the same level of coordination, creativity, diligence, and far-reaching approaches established by public health officials for COVID-19. In August 2016, our coalition offered 41 comprehensive recommendations on how to improve the police service and community relations. 2 years in, we asked for a status update and received little more than non-committal empty words around each one. And we are exactly 2 years to that date. 4 years, we have sought to negotiate, to discuss, and to politely urge those in authority to take substantive actions to address the circumstances of Abdurrahman's death and the underlying issues and policies that enabled his life to be taken the way that it did. Demands for justice have reached a boiling point, and we cannot ignore them. We are tired of waiting patiently for this system to work. The undeniable truth is that it is killing us. The unjust killing of Abdurrahman is the hallmark of a broken system. It is a betrayal of a duty by police, by those with which we have entrusted the most significant of responsibilities. The use of force in a society where violence is otherwise universally abhorred.
Can you all still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thanks, Fahia. So what is the solution? We need to reimagine what law enforcement looked like in Ottawa. Consider the following. From 2014 to 2020, the OPS budget increased by 37%, while inflation was less than 3%. We're talking about a $97 million increase in police budgets, while the health service budget decreased $88 million in the same period. This year alone, the OPS budget increased by $12.7 million to $358 million. This means that the police budget cost the taxpayers more than transportation, libraries, and the public health combined. So the solution to police brutality and racial inequalities in policing is simple, as far as we see it: defund police. Instead of funding a police force that resembles an armed militia, invest a sizable chunk of our city's budget in communities, especially marginalized ones where much of the policing occurs. By defunding, we're not calling for the abolition of policing, rather a proper reallocation of funding that could begin the process of ending the culture of police brutality. It means understanding that many Black and other racialized Canadians would never call the police for help for fear they might end up dead. And this is no surprise, as history tells us that the original idea of policing comes from the South in the US, where from slave patrols, where they were hired to recapture escaped slaves. Then, when slavery was abolished, the police enforced Jim Crow laws, even for the most minor infractions. And Canadian policing has a similar history. The Mounties were created for a specific purpose, to assert sovereignty over Indigenous people and their land. Our own Prime Minister, our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, got the idea for the Mounties from the Royal Irish Constabulary, a paramilitary force that the British created to keep the Irish under control. Macdonald envisioned his own constabulary, except instead of the Irish, they would control Indigenous people living on the land. And today, police disproportionately use force against Black people, and Black people are more likely to be arrested and sentenced. The history is ingrained in our law enforcement. Reallocation means we can invest in social services for mental health, domestic violence, and homelessness, among others. Police are often the first responders to all three, and they shouldn't be, given that most 911 calls are for mental health services, health, and EMT and fire services. So our proposal is this. Given all this, we propose that the Ottawa Police Service immediately launch a co-development process with the community to identify to which social services it would be most effective to shift police funding and create a plan to do so. Particular focus should be on immediately establishing non-lethal, compassionate responders in the case of people experiencing mental health crises.
Members of the board, I want to leave you with this final thought. Given this brief historical context, it should be no surprise to you that the last several weeks has forced us, North America, to finally face this racist history. And as a police service board responsible for the National Capital's police force, you need to take these matters very seriously. In addition to considering our proposal for the reallocation of funding, I'd like to leave you with the following. 5 minutes is not enough time to express the pains the community is suffering. 5 minutes is not enough time to dismantle a policing system rooted in racism and slavery. 5 minutes is not enough time to root out racism within the ranks. When will this board hold a public session dedicated to this issue and give it the time that it needs? When will the board members themselves carve out the time in their own lives to set aside and do some deep soul searching and reviewing of policies and ask yourselves, what systems are harming our communities? What biases do I have that might make me blind to the community's experiences? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are all in agreement that there is a very strong need and call for change. And I think I can assure you that the board absolutely wants to be part of that. But I want to turn it over to my fellow board members for specific questions. Are there any board members who wish to ask a question of the presentation, the presenters?
Yes, Acting Chair, I will have a brief comment, not a
Please.
question. I would like to thank the presentators for your deep thoughts, and I can assure you that we will work together to eradicate and make the changes which the community is looking for.
Thank you, Member Nerman. Are there any other board members who wish to weigh in? I think one of the things I can say on sort of a larger picture, this issue has been building for a long time. And I think we've sort of realized there is a time and place for police, but it's not all the time and it's not every place. And what we really, and that's what it's become. And we really need to look at a way of rebalancing that. So I can assure you this is something that every board member is seized with and is treating seriously. And we will give the time, we will make the time for you. I personally commit that certainly I'm prepared to sit down and have a much more in-depth dialogue. And I know that when we're on our previous board, when we reached out and looked for changes that happened, we realized that there had to be changes from the bottom to the top. And unfortunately, and I realize how this is upsetting to many people, but in an organization like this, sometimes changes take time. And I know that sounds like an excuse, but it is a reality that we faced. But once again, I really appreciate your taking the time to come and speak to us in a thoughtful manner and outline the issues as you see them. And I commit to you that we will make sure that we make the time for you to hear what you have to say. So thank you once again. And unless there's any other board members who want to weigh in.
Yes,
thank
Chair.
you. Yes, sorry,
Chair,
Robert.
this is Robert.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to thank both presenters for continuing to bring this to the forefront. I don't have a question, but I just want to reiterate what Chair Smallwood said and what Member Nermit had said, that we are definitely here to listen and to put change forward. I want to thank you for continuing to bring this forward, and we are definitely willing to work with all stakeholders on making the change that's required. Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Are there any other questions from board members?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much once again. Okay, the next person that has signed up to speak is Mr. Sam Hirsch. I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Hirsch now.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Hello, bonjour. Obviously, before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded and surrendered territory of Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and obviously, given the current context of police violence, it's very important to acknowledge it. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the recent death of Chantal Moore of the Micmac Nation. Her death came only days after the commissioner of the RCMP denied the very existence of systemic racism in the organization. Donc, merci au monde de la commission pour me donner la parole ici aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Sam Hirsch et je suis ici aujourd'hui comme membre d'une nouvelle organisation qui s'appelle Horizon Ottawa. Un regroupement des résidents et résidentes de partout à travers la ville d'Ottawa qui veut voir un changement au sein de non seulement notre ville, mais aussi notre conseil municipal. Our organization has as part of its mission to create a city that genuinely works for everyone. And right now, especially when it comes to racialized folks in our city, first, I want to address the public participation at this meeting today. Currently on the list, including myself, there are only 4 public delegations. Now compare that to the 112 speakers we had for the discussion around the urban boundary a couple of weeks ago with the planning committee. You'd think that given the context and visibility of this issue the past couple of weeks, there would be more speakers here, but that isn't the case. And I highly doubt that it's because of a lack of. I know anecdotally that councillors received thousands of emails specifically on this issue. We had a rally in the city, as I'm sure you're all well aware, that had thousands of people at it. One of the biggest rallies I've ever seen in the city. The issue here isn't a lack of public interest, but a lack of public accountability, rather, that police have in general. Why is it that when all other city committee meetings require 24 hours notice to speak, the police service board meeting requires no? Why is it although we as taxpayers provide funding for the police, city council or any other resident have absolutely no say in how the police spend their budget? And why is it that when Black or brown or indigenous people are harmed by police, often are not afforded the justice they so rightfully deserve? It's clear that the current approach to public safety in the city isn't working. And while I appreciate the spirit of Member Nerman's motion on the racism in the OPS on the agenda today, nowhere in that motion does it talk about how to tackle the root of causes of crime by reducing the police budget and reallocating those resources in community services. In Mayor Jim Watson's own words from his 2009 budget speech earlier this year, building safer communities requires a more balanced approach on spending. More boots on the ground, he says, will not solve the root causes of crime in our many different neighborhoods. And we agree with that, as I'm sure most people would. This is not a new or novel idea, but if this is the case for the mayor, why does he allow 10% of our entire city budget to be spent on police services? And to give you an idea of how much, or rather $358 million actually is, $358 million would be enough for food to the over 60,000 food insecure households in Ottawa for 6 months. It'd be enough to cover over 3 months of rent for everyone renting an apartment in the city. And it would be enough to pay for over 2 months of childcare for every single child in Ottawa, aged 0 to 12. Massive reallocation of resources, as it has been done in many cities already around the world, like in Eugene, Oregon, where their HOOTS program replaces police with medics and mental health workers to respond to those going through crises. Again, this isn't a new idea. with funding equal, with funding equal to only 2% of their police force. They've answered 17% of the department's overall call volume. Not only has this approach been safer, but it's actually also saved the city money, about $8.5 million per year. Finally, before I conclude, I'd like to address the recent assault of Obi Afedi, something the Justice for Abdi Coalition wanted to address, but given the strict time constraints of this board meeting, we're not able to. So what I'm about to do is by them and sent to me. Just as with Abraham Abdi's death, an assault of Obi Afedi here in Ottawa is just another example of how violence against Black people has been willfully ignored by our institutions. On April 4th, a bylaw officer punched Afedi in the mouth while he was on the ground near Michelle Heights Park during a physical distancing crackdown. Afedi was ticketed $2,010 for 2 violations under the Provincial Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, which had taken effect 2 days earlier. Following an investigation of the incident, police found that the bylaw officer committed assault, and the bylaw officer himself confessed to wrongdoing at the police have yet to lay charges. This man's daughter had to witness her father being punched in the face, for taking her out to get some air. So that the Justice for Abdi Committee and NADA are calling on and asking this board: will you launch a thorough and impartial investigation into the assault of Obi Afedi at the hands of a bylaw officer as to why preferential treatment was afforded to the officer in question by the Ottawa Police Service? The City of Ottawa must immediately drop any fines levied against Mr. Afedi during this incident and work with community partners to address racism, not only within the police, but within Ottawa's bylaw department as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would just like to point out one thing. This board does not have the mandate to carry out investigations. We're a policy board. We do budgeting, we do strategic direction, but we do not have the ability to do investigations. But with respect to the one incident you mentioned, I will be raising a policy question in my inquiries later in the meeting, specifically about the incident that you mentioned. I also wanted to mention, just so you know, that some of the board members, I think we're having difficulty with your connection. I know your voice seemed to be fading in and out and was quite broken up at times. So hopefully they were able to get the gist of what you were saying. And with that, I'll turn it over to my fellow board members and see if there are any questions, follow-up questions that they have for you. I'm not hearing any, and I'm not sure, Caroline, I know sometimes I'm not seeing the hands, but I just want to make sure that that everybody's okay in terms of that they were able to hear the presentation.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much. Yes, I want to thank Mr. Hirsch for his presentation. He's obviously very passionate about this. I just wanted to ask, I guess my question is, Mr. Hirsch, would you be satisfied if, I know we're talking about reallocation of funds, but 80% of the Ottawa Police budget pays for bodies, like that's staffing, salaries. So only 20% of it goes to programs. Would you advocate for slashing the number of police officers in this city? Because right now we have neighborhoods that are dry, they're crying for more police officers, and we're trying to put them there, but we just don't have the resources. So I guess what I'm asking is, when we say reallocation, that includes staffing. How do you feel about cutting the ranks of the police? Is that something that you are looking at or would want?
Can you hear me? Is my connection okay?
I can hear you now. You sound clear now.
Okay, good. I apologize before about if my connection sort of skewed what I was saying, but thanks for your question, Councillor Meehan. And to that, I would say, first of all, that I think people to imagine an alternative to policing, because that's all people have known for a very long time. So in that context, people have been asking for more police, a lot of them, because I think that they don't know an alternative to ask for other than more police for protection. And again, to that point, I would ask, on the subject like the police or anything else, building more roads or something like that. When it comes to the police, there's always a furor, a public outcry when those things are cut. But when it comes to cutting social services, when it comes to cutting staff from public health, cutting funding from libraries, for example, there's no outcry or not similar outcry than there is to the police. So I would ask you a similar question, like why are we okay with cutting social services, but not okay with cutting the police? Why do police continuously get budget increases while departments like libraries, public health, and other ones get a funding decrease at the expense of the police?
I think you may have answered your own question. That is because the public sees and wants the police to receive the funding, and that is what they have. When we did an outreach, I know that there was comments about accessibility and ability to speak to the board. We did a across the city outreach to all communities, all councillors, all various groups, and we asked them what they wanted to see in their policing and what changes they wanted to see. And what was made very clear to us is they wanted to see an increased investment in neighborhood policing. That was a very, very clear message that the board took away from its outreach. And that is why we made the changes we did to increase the amount of neighborhood police, what are called NRTs, neighborhood resource teams. We spent the time and the effort to say that's what the public wanted. And so we directed the police in that direction. When we do our planning, that's what we do. We listen to what the public says. Now, sometimes it's contradictory. There's demands, for instance, for body cameras, and that takes a huge amount of resources. There's demands for community policing. And at the same time, there's requests that we look at reducing the funding to the police. And yet, as Councillor Meehan has suggested, it's actually 86% of our budget goes to compensation. There's an additional amount that is payments that we have no control over, which takes us to 92%, which means we only have 8% of the budget that's really discretionary. And that deals with things like vehicles and other items that are non-compensation related. So we are challenged there, but I do hope that you will attend the budget, because we will be having public opportunity to speak to the budget and go over the amount of money that comes in and where it goes out to. Are there any other any other board members that have questions for Mr. Hirsch? I'm not hearing any, so I will thank you very much once again for your comments. And obviously, as Councillor Meehan suggested, you're very passionate about it, and that's important. I would like to now go on to our fourth presenter. Thank you. Ethan Sabra, if you would like to start to give your presentation.
Hi, just making sure that I sound relatively clear.
Yes, you do.
Okay, hi. I want to preface my comments just by calling back to the last time that I spoke publicly about an issue of municipal politics, which was just a few short weeks ago at the public comment to the Planning Committee. Along with many community organizations, I stood in opposition to urban boundary expansion. This might seem unrelated to the Police Services Board, but I do want to just quote from my speaking notes at that meeting. I then asked councillors to consider simple and sometimes radical ideas that can bloom under legislative constraints. I suggested possibilities like city-backed food production and distribution plans that put the means of food production to the hands of regular citizens, ranging from the planting and harvesting of fruit trees across the city to helping establish front yard gardens at suburban farms. I advocated for the expansion, electrification, and delivery of free public transit for all in order to drastically reduce our dependence on cars. And finally, I urged the committee to consider a sharp reduction in the Ottawa Police Services budget in order to help the city support the construction and maintenance of social housing. These demands for defunding the police are not new. They are not only in response to the killing of George Floyd, or of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Chantel Moore, DeAndre Campbell, Ijaz Chaudhry, or Rodney Levy. They are in response to the list of names itself, which has been growing since the advent of policing in Canada, when the Northwestern Mounted Police were founded to clear Indigenous peoples off their lands to allow for colonization, like Robin said before. Back at that urban boundary meeting, I begged the committee to imagine a radically just, open, and utopian city which works for all. Today, I ask you, members of the Police Services Board, to join me in the same act of imagining. We are seeing the power of a global uprising against policing, calling on cities to reconsider their priorities and to invest heavily in the kinds of services that really keep their citizens safe. That means divesting from our police service and reinvesting that money and more into those earlier points from public housing to free public transport. It also means rethinking our emergency response units. We do not need to bring armed officers to situations where people are in mental health crises. And even if they are not armed, we do not need to bring police officers at all. In the case of Abdirahman Abdi, who deserves some semblance of justice, and I would say the immediate firing of Mr. Monsian, who's managed to make more than $500,000 in compensation from the city since he brutally beat a resident of our city to death, we can see that even without the use of firearms or tasers, or even batons, the police in our city will use their license to kill, and they defend that license even when it is so obviously and blatantly used against the vulnerable, as we can see by the campaign to support Mr. Monsian with thin blue line style bracelets sold by members of the OPS to each other and to other police forces across the country. Instead of bringing the police to health crises, we should be bringing only trained, unarmed de-escalation professionals, mental and physical health experts, and others who may be needed to assist in addressing the cause of the crisis. Like in several cases in Canada, as outlined in Desmond Cole's book, The Skin We're In, police are responding to residents who are in crisis as they're in the process of being evicted from their homes. In multiple such situations, including the killings of Pierre Coriolan and Mashwar Madout, police have killed the person in distress. I think this shows that it would be worthwhile to ban the practice of evictions. I know that's not your jurisdiction. At the very least, we should be providing housing and housing support workers to these people in crisis, not cops. I hope, though I do not assume, that members of the board have had a chance to look over the demands of the Black Lives Matter Toronto around policing. I'll repeat a few of them that are imperative to take action on immediately. Remove police and school resource officers in all schools at all levels across Canada, number 6. Number 7, end all special constable programs and all policing on campuses. Number 8, end the policing of public transportation. Number 11, end police collaboration with the CBSA. 12, eliminate all stealth police cars and plainclothes operations. 21, invest in community support for shelters, drop-ins, after-school programming in low-income Black and Indigenous neighborhoods. 24, establish a community-based trauma-informed emergency services for people who have experienced gender-based violence. 25, implement civilian transportation safety service and better/safer road infrastructure for pedestrians, cyclists, and public transit, as we can see we need in Ottawa from this week, or last week, sorry. Provide permanent secure housing options for all people who need housing, that's number 27. All 27 are available at blacklivesmatter.ca. It is time to build a healthier, safer, and more caring city. I believe that might be what your job is asking of you. It is definitely what your city is asking you. I was at the Regis Korchinski Paquette Vigil, the protest at Parliament Hill, and the protest on Saturday outside of the police station in City Hall. It is time to act. I direct the board to commit to implementing the relevant changes from BLMTO, including defunding the police by a significant amount as soon as possible. I also suggest that you all read or listen to interviews about the work of Angela Davis, Miriam Kaba, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. The latter is very easily accessible in the latest 2 episodes of the Intercepted podcast. Please actually listen to it. We can do this. We can change how things work in this city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think, as you have correctly pointed out, this is a community-wide problem, and the police are one component of it, but a very important one. And you've put a big challenge out there, and I think it's going to be a challenge the board has to take up. So I want to turn it over to fellow board members. Are there any questions of Mr. Sabra? I'm not hearing any questions. If I don't hear any in the next second or so, I'll have to say thank you very much for your presentation. And
It's really a thank you for the time you took to come and to make that comprehensive presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bev. Any other comments? If not, then like Bev said, I do want to thank you. I know it's people have a lot on their tables, and to take the time to come out to speak about things you're passionate about is very important. And that's why we're here. As Member Nerman had said before, we're here to listen. So that's what we're doing. And hopefully we will be able to take away some good things from the presentation. So thank you very much. I also have Councillor Ralston King has signed up to speak, but I understand you're looking to speak to Member Nerman's motion, which is item 2 on the agenda. So I will hold that. And Councillor Teresa Kavanagh, Councillor, I understand you're looking to speak to Member Nerman's motion as well, which is item 2 on the agenda. as well as item number 4. So we'll hold your comments until we get to those items on the agenda. So the next item on the agenda for us are the committee meetings, the reports from committee chairs and minutes. And the one that we have is the Finance and Audit Committee meetings, number 10 of the 4th of June, 2020. As chair of the Finance and Audit Committee, I will provide a brief update on the meeting that took place on June 4th. We continue to discuss the budget pressures the OPS is facing as a result of the pandemic, both for 2020 and in future years. All financial options are on the table for review and consideration. The service has been working very hard to mitigate the COVID-19 related pressures, and I wish to commend staff for everything they've done. There's been significant public attention, commentary, and requests for changes to the funding of the police. Well, I think a discussion around optimizing the effectiveness of our investments in community safety is very healthy. We need to have these discussions in a manner that ensures the important services that residents require to feel safe can still be delivered. As a board, we are responsible for approving a budget that will ensure adequate and effective policing services can be provided in the City of Ottawa. To echo the comments previously made by the chief, we cannot make funding decisions out of retribution or from a place of fear, grief, or anger, which is currently being experienced around the globe. I also want to use this opportunity to highlight the public consultation process that takes place as part of our annual budget process. Every year, the board welcomes public delegations as part of its budget development process. Typically, budget tabling takes place in early November, preceded by a meeting of the board's Finance and Audit Committee, where delegates are welcome to present on the budget. The budget is then considered by the board at the November monthly meeting, which takes place the 4th Monday of the month. Members of the public looking to provide input into the 2021 Ottawa Police budget are therefore encouraged to participate in our public consultation in the fall. While we have not yet set the date for our budget tabling, the board typically follows the budget timelines of the city. I am unsure at this time whether the timelines will be shifted as a result of the pandemic. However, we will post the meeting dates on our website once they have been determined. So with that, that the Ottawa Police Services Board received this report for information. Is this report received?
Received.
Are there any dissents? Okay, now I'm going to move on to inquiries. I have 3 inquiries I would like to raise, and I will then turn it over to other board members in case they should have any. Chief, I will let you determine whether these questions can be answered tonight or whether you will need to report back at a future meeting of the board. The first item is an incident involving the bylaw officer. There have been a number of questions and concerns raised around an incident that took place in April in Michelle Heights Park involving a bylaw officer and a member of the public. For the benefit of the board and the community, and without getting into the specifics of the investigation, I have a few follow-up questions for you, Chief. First, can you provide assurances that the bylaw officer who was the subject in this particular investigation was treated as any other member of the public would be in a similar circumstance? The next point is that I understand this matter was referred to the pre-charge diversion program. Can you provide some background on when and why this alternative judicial measure is used? So Chief, I can read the other 2 inquiries I have, and perhaps that's best unless you wanted to interrupt and make some comments. I will go to the next inquiry. The next, sorry? Okay, the next inquiry is use of force and de-escalation. In recent weeks, the use of force by police has been highlighted. I came across a chart from the United States that breaks down the amount of training time for police dedicated to firearms, legislation, communications, etc. I can provide the high-level bar chart I came across if you would like to see it. I would like to know if the OPS would be able to provide at a future date a similar breakdown of how training time is broken down. I think this would help the board have a better understanding of how training time is allocated and may help us determine whether we are investing enough time in critical areas such as communication, de-escalation, etc., as compared to firearms and defensive tactics, for example. And then my third inquiry was with respect to body-worn cameras for public. We've received a number, the board has received a number of emails from members of the public demanding that body-worn cameras be instituted for all police officers. I think it's important for our board and the police service to be considering any and all available options for effectively improving police accountability and enhancing trust. Having said that, options will vary in terms of effectiveness and return on investment. In terms of body cameras specifically, I recognize there are pros and cons associated with the technology. The board and the service would need to undertake significant policy work prior to any sort of rollout to consider aspects such as privacy and data governance. They would also require significant financial investment in terms of the technology and data storage. Chief, to what extent do you see body cameras as an accountability measure that we should be exploring going forward? And I know you have done research on body cameras and have closely followed their success and failure elsewhere in the world where they have been employed. Should we be actively looking into investigating this technology? And we'd be looking forward for your recommendations. And I'd also add that I think there could be a perception based on what people see in the United States, where the public seems to get immediate copies of or access to the body cam footage. I would imagine that given the systems we have in place here, that simply wouldn't happen. And if they did get any access, it would be heavily redacted. So those are the inquiries I have. And I noticed that Member Nerman, I'm not sure if you have an inquiry or a question with respect to the inquiries I have, but Member Nerman, I'll turn it to you now.
Thank you, Acting Chair Smallwood. Yes, I have an inquiry, and thank you, Chief. As Chair Smallwood has stated, you can answer my inquiry now or later as deemed appropriate. But this is also concerning the use of force. Chief, as we all are witnessing the police brutality, especially on the Black and Indigenous population at local and national levels, and I understand that as per the use of force training in OPS, officers are not taught to place their knee or on any other body part on the subject's neck or head. Is that correct?
So Member Nerman, I know that we did ask that question before, and we were assured that that process is not allowed, is banned in Ottawa, but I'll turn it to the chief if he wants to confirm.
But I have further to that. So if it is the answer is yes, I can assume yes, then I can go further.
Sure.
Chief, generally there is a fear in the minds of the population about the tactics being used in that direction, especially in the minds of racialized population, people with mental illness, people with language barriers, and I emphasize language barriers. The recent shooting in Mississauga of 62-year-old man, Mr. Ijaz Ahmed, is one such live and recent example. So Chief, do you have plans to revisit the use of force techniques at OPS in the coming weeks? And how do you plan to communicate the same with the Ottawa population so that they are well educated and aware of this vital component? And I will be thankful if I can have some definite time frame of action being initiated and implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Member Nerman. Chief, I'm not sure if you want to have these inquiries tabled so that you can come back with more fulsome replies, or is there something you wanted to address at this point?
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. Member Nerman. I will just quickly run through the list as I've captured it. Hopefully I haven't made any mistakes in interpretation. First of all, in regards, Chair, to your first item, the investigation involving Mr. Fetty as a victim, that is an ongoing criminal matter. It is also, I understand, an ongoing labor matter at City Hall, and so I'm precluded from offering any comment on those matters until they are resolved fully. I will make a commitment that to the fullest extent we can debrief the board and any other public debriefing from our involvement in that matter. I'll seek counsel, but I will commit to being as complete and as transparent as I can be once the matters are resolved. The second item you raised was in regards to use of force, de-escalation specifically. If you don't mind, we'll tie that to Member Nerman's specific questions around use of force techniques. We are already conducting a review of what we're training our officers on. I've shared some of that information with the board. I will commit to coming back to the board if the agenda permits at the next board meeting, where Superintendent Patterson, CAO Letourneau, and our PDC training staff can provide a full overview of the current state and any potential recommendations or changes that we will make between now and then and going forward. That is a regular standing item for board agenda items, and so it is an area that the public has a regular updating on. But given recent circumstances, we will make sure that we make available to the board the opportunity to have a specific agenda item on that or a specific fulsome response to the related inquiries today. In regards to body-worn camera, a significant issue that requires a significant response. I don't think the inquiry portion of this would allow me to be fulsome enough. I'll reference it very briefly in my comments later on to the board. Again, should the board want to receive in a public session a full review on what we're considering, absolutely will. I think it does relate to a number of the previous deputations. It will be the same context of my comments. There is a potential return on investment for that type of exercise, but it will come at the cost of something else. And so we'll have to make difficult choices around how to produce the best service as well as the highest level of trust. Member Nerman, one of your points, I believe, in your use of force inquiry related to the ability of officers to communicate with those members of the community for whom English is not their first language, or who themselves may have an inability to understand spoken word. This is an ongoing challenge in any institution to provide that type of customized level of communication, particularly in crisis. There certainly are a number of HR practices, from recruiting and hiring members who speak multiple languages to the use of technology and universal interpreter systems that are capable now on smart devices. Again, those are all investments that need to be made. There are no quick fixes for that, and any investment requires a choice. I agree in principle with what you're talking about. The practical application of that principle will always be a little bit more tricky. Again, happy to come back to the board in a combination of use of force training, as well as recruiting and hiring and talent management within the organization. I think substantively, though, Chair, my response is all good questions. Some require the completion of judicial processes and labor reviews, and others require time for us to prepare substantive answers. My commitment is that we can come back with substantive answers to the board by the next board meeting in July.
Thank you very much, Chief. And you made a comment if the agenda permits, and I can assure you these items are extremely important. So there will be certainly we will make time on the agenda to have a public airing of these discussions. I mention again to the members of the public, the only questions that can come forward at this point are people who are registered to speak or members of the board. Occasionally we'll see a hand pop up from a member of the public, but unfortunately this is not an open session where questions can come from the floor. You do have the ability to speak, but you have to put your name in to make a presentation. I'll now go to other board members. Are there any inquiries that they would like to bring forward at this time? Okay, I'm not hearing any other inquiries. So at this point, we'll go to items of business. And the first item of business is the Chief's verbal report. We'll hold this until we've done with the other items, the consent items. Number two is the recommendations for addressing systemic racism, discrimination, and bias, and creating a more equitable and inclusive Ottawa Police Service. So we're going to hold this because we have public delegations on it. So we'll move to item number 3, which is response to inquiry 1-20-05 protocols used by OPS to get rid of all police cruisers. The chief has provided us with a report on that item. My question would be, is this report received? Is this item received?
Chair Smallwood, I have a brief question on this one. Just
Of
a
course.
clarification.
Sure, please.
So thank you, Chief and Jeff, for responding to this inquiry, which I raised in the month of April. I have just a brief clarification, if Jeff can answer that. In paragraph 3, you have stated that the vehicle is then shipped to auction for sale and the check with the buyer's information is sent back to the OPS. So will it be reasonable to say that once these vehicles, once they are decommissioned, they go for an auction, they can be bought by any members of the public, that can be individuals or any members? Because in your last line, it says at no point are any OPS fleet related items sold directly to the public. So just a clarification on that.
Chief, did you want to answer that, or did you want to turn it over to someone else?
I'll ask Chief Administration Officer Letourneau to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So paragraph 3, Mr. Nerman, paragraph 3 is correct. Vehicles are completely stripped and sold at auction. They can be sold to the public. The last point in the statement refers to OPS specific markings or specific items that could make a vehicle look like a police vehicle, such as light bars or decals. That's what that last point refers to.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
That's okay with you?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So is the item received?
Received.
Any dissents? Not hearing any, I'll go on to the next one, number 4, which is response to inquiry 120-06, community outreach to prevent gender-based violence, particularly outreach to racialized women. We will hold this item as we have a public delegation. Number 5, outstanding board inquiries and motions, June 2020, Executive Director's Report. That the Ottawa Police Services Board received this report for information. Is this item received?
Received.
Received.
Any dissents? Not hearing any. The next item on the agenda is letters of commendation. That the Ottawa Police Services Board received this report for information. Is the item received?
Received.
Received.
Any dissents? Not hearing any. I'll now return to items number 1, 2, and 4. So item number 1 is all the way back up to the Chief's verbal report. Chief, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir à tous. I will admit, although my regular reports are a bit long, this one's going to be a bit longer. There's been a lot that's transpired since the last board meeting. First, I want to start my report by welcoming the newest board member, Ms. Bev Johnson. You've arrived at a very pivotal time in the history of the service, the city, and the country. Welcome to the deep end of the pool. That said, your career as a doctor and your lived experience as a successful businesswoman will be a great source of insight and inspiration for the board and the service on several critical and relevant files. Next, I want to acknowledge the previous deputations made, and I want to commit myself, my command team, and my police service to deeply considering, discussing, and learning from the information and perspectives shared by the deputies. The time, effort, and courage it must have taken these individuals is important to recognize. The deputations will help inform, influence, and in some cases inspire the changes that we will be making in the Ottawa Police Service. Since my last update to the board a month ago, there have been a series of tragedies that have occurred in Canada, North America, and around the world. Some of these involve members of the Black communities, along with members of our Indigenous and Aboriginal communities. I have deep personal and professional sadness for any loss of life in any circumstances, for any inequity or injustice in any circumstance, and for all who suffer directly or indirectly in such tragedies and injustices. Over the same time period, we have seen 2 related peaceful marches in Ottawa, where people from all backgrounds and all parts of the city came together to speak, to listen, to learn, and to commit to a more safe, just, and inclusive city. This included hundreds of Ottawa Police Service members and their families who were either directly participating in the marches or directly serving and protecting all of those who were participating in the marches. We came together in safety and solidarity in an effort to usher in needed changes in policing, as well as in all aspects of our democratic society. Organizations and institutions are made up of imperfect humans. No matter how well intended, designed, or implemented, the systems created by humans are also by design imperfect and will therefore be unintended. They will therefore have unintended systemic impacts. If you discover a rotten apple, you have to heal it or get rid of it. You then also have to check the overall health of the tree that produced it. From the deepest roots, which is the organization's culture, to the highest branches, its oversight bodies, chiefs, command officers, and senior management. Too often we focus on the rotten apple or the few bad apples and forget about the tree that produced it. Since the day that I was sworn in as chief of police, I have made public statements about the growing love and pride that I have for the city of Ottawa and the Ottawa Police Service and its members. My love and pride grows despite the events that have exposed individual corruption, criminality, and misconduct, as well as systemic level issues that we continue to face in this organization. I believe I can fully express my love and pride for this organization and its members and the city, while still acknowledging and addressing weaknesses and problems. Acknowledging and addressing weaknesses and problems is not a condemnation of all individuals. Neither is acknowledging a systemic issue a condemnation of the entire organization, the city, or the society. There are systemic issues in all Canadian institutions. The policing and justice system, healthcare, education, our financial systems, and even in the media itself. We have made progress in reforming these systems and these institutions. It is why I believe that Canada has the best police officers, has the best justice system, and is the best country in the world. But reforms have not been enough. Individuals, institutions, and the society as a whole needs to do more and grow more to meet the current and future challenges. Let me speak more specifically about policing. And I remind folks I've spoken about these things on TED Talks, op-eds, media interviews, public forums, and board meetings. More importantly, I spent the last 25 years of my life implementing these ideas in policing, despite sometimes heavy resistance, and quite often a lack of resources, in some cases zero resources. From an HR standpoint, we are still not representative of the demographics of the communities that we serve. From an operations standpoint, we're still too reactive and enforcement focused. From a financial standpoint, we need to curb the cost of policing. From a cultural standpoint, we have to abandon the idea of a thin blue line that separates us from the community and instead embrace a thin blue thread culture that sees police interwoven with all other threads in the fabric of society to create a stronger national safety net, social safety net, where no one falls between the cracks. An inclusive quilt where every thread is visible, distinct, and contributes to our national identity and indeed our national security. We are dealing with multiple existential generational crises right now. Systemic, institutional, societal racism, workplace sexual violence and harassment, climate change, global warming, the COVID-19 pandemic, and its spin-off economical effects that it's producing a massive global economic crisis. We seem to have forgotten about the opioid crisis. There has been a recent spike in the ongoing epidemic of fatal drug overdoses across Canada and right here in the nation's capital. We need to use these crises to implement needed change within our institutions and across society. We need police in society. We need humane police. We need good police. We need good and healthy people in all of our communities. We need safe communities. The best way to stop a bullet or a pandemic is with good health, education, jobs, affordable housing. A good way to stop a bullet is also with courageous, compassionate, caring cops working in and with and for community. We must change the operating model of policing from being simply the entry point into the criminal justice system to being a point of referral to a wide variety of integrated non-criminal streams, many of which are far better positioned to solve both the symptoms and the underlying issues of crime in our communities. We must align police services more closely with other core human services and human service institutions, social services, education, public health, and of course, the not-for-profit sector. We are hearing people say it's time for change. Many of those people are right here within the Ottawa Police Service. Our frontline officers, senior NCOs, senior officers, and command officers want the same thing. Change for good, needed change. I've heard these similar tragedies over the course of my 3 decades in policing. And I'm in the last half decade of my policing career at the rank of chief, and I'm determined to implement substantive, long-needed changes right here in the police service of jurisdiction in the nation's capital. That is why I applied to be the Ottawa Police Service Chief. I believe that is why the Ottawa Police Service Board hired me. And that is why I'm staying right here to get the job done. I am not alone in this work. I'm supported by a growing critical mass of other change-enabling leaders inside the Ottawa Police Service and in all of the city's many diverse communities. All these leaders know that this is not the time for incremental change. This is not the time for resisting change. This is a time for systemic change, and not just in policing, but across the justice system and across the human services institutions, indeed across all of civil society. No matter how hard we work, and certainly here in Ottawa, our commitment is to work as hard as we possibly can to make improvements. But no matter how hard we work, bias, prejudice, hate, and violence are all parts of the human condition. And they will therefore be present in all human-made families, communities, organizations, and institutions. That is why this work will always be challenging and must be focused on continuing effort and improvement. The goal cannot be for perfection and or the complete eradication of these human failings, as this is impossible to achieve. Instead, the goal must be for continuously reducing the frequency and intensity of all such incidents of ignorance, intolerance, indifference, and or intentional hurt, as well as to continuously improve our ability to review, redress, recover, and be restored from such incidents when, not if, they occur. This change is something that we all need to be invested in. We can agree to disagree on the nature, pace, and direction of the change, but we must all agree that change is needed so we can be better and do better for each other. The change need not be transformative or overly complicated. It is as simple as accepting the need to change, learning from others about the types of changes that are needed, and then taking ownership of those solutions. The simplest and most critical thing that we need to do is to make a true personal commitment, an organizational commitment to treat each other with dignity, respect, and humanity. I do want to take some time to discuss the issue of defunding and disbanding police. Since the tragic death of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis, it's created a whole raft of social media posts and hashtags. While these are not inconsequential expressions of genuine frustration, they're not sufficient to actually produce the changes in policing and society to address the decades and in fact centuries old issues of individual, systemic, or institutional discrimination, specifically anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. Defunding and disbanding any institution is a complex issue. It requires careful analysis, even more careful planning, implementation, and evaluation. In Canada, police services exist because of legislation from all 3 levels of government: federal statutes, provincial police service acts, and municipal acts and funding. It would take years of careful planning and implementing to create any sort of alternative and capable 24/7, 365 service delivery option other than the police, fire, and ambulance. Not that it's impossible, but the level of effort would be significant, and the commitment to that change would have to be generational. Cutting costs from policing usually results in a few things. And Chair, you rightfully pointed out the balance of budget within any police service, certainly the police service here in Ottawa. When we talk about deep cuts, we're talking about cutting training that will actually stop the reform process that is already underway. Cutting technology investments would be counterproductive. It would eliminate our ability to even consider the application of body-worn cameras. Never mind the impact that it might have had in the COVID-19 pandemic, when a significant percentage of our workforce had to work from home using investments in technology that this board wisely made in the previous few years to allow more of our members to have access to laptops and smartphones. Police are the intake funnel for and an integral part of the larger justice system. One of the fundamental responsibilities of the federal government is to protect the nation from external and internal threats and harm. The national, provincial, regional, and municipal police agencies are also a core element of our national security capability here in Canada. It addresses specifically issues of domestic and international terror operations, multinational, transnational criminal organizations and the investigations into them, cyber crime that can be committed literally anywhere in the world on local residents, critical infrastructure protection, which is quite prolific here in the nation's capital, as well as responding to natural and human disasters, including floods and tornadoes that have occurred here on a regular basis in Ottawa. The police, therefore, cannot simply be defunded or disbanded without massive impacts to the entire justice system, our national security systems, and our ability to be resilient against Mother Nature. The police are only part of the social fabric and the social contract in any democracy like Canada. Even if we could wave a magic wand and fix every police service and every police member, or quite frankly, even disband policing, you would still have to reform the entire justice system along with all other public and private institutions, because they are part of a wider range of societal inequalities and injustices that impact and enable racism or any form of individual, group, or systemic discrimination. For a variety of legitimate and less than legitimate reasons, we have seen the defunding and disbanding of other institutions in the past. For example, in the 1950s and 60s, we saw this happen to the psychiatric hospitals and mental institutions without commensurate plans to make investments and prepare communities for the outflow of these patients, without sustainable financial investments into institutions like policing, the community, and not-for-profit agencies. This resulted, quite frankly, in a disaster. This defunding and disbanding in the healthcare and the complete erosion of this part of the social safety net resulted in currently what we are facing in some jurisdictions as much as 70 to 90% of police work now dealing with people in mental health and addictions crises on a 24/7, 365 basis. This example of defunding and disbanding of institutions was ill-conceived, poorly implemented, badly funded, and have led to many of the problems that we now see today in policing. I like the deputants who talked about reimagining, reconceiving of policing. I truly believe in this. Police unfortunately focus first and most on reactive law enforcement versus proactive prevention and interventions. This operating model is the most costly in terms of finances and social costs. Sometimes those social costs include the loss of life, the tragic loss of life. They are the least effective way of providing public safety, community safety, and well-being. We have learned from past failures like the war on drugs, and we have recent examples of more effective health-focused approaches, like the approach to our national opioid crisis, and indeed our ongoing approach to the COVID-19 pandemic. We can reimagine and realign policing. Policing under the new legislation in the Police Service Act of Ontario that requires every municipal government to design and implement and evaluate a community safety and well-being plan that brings together the police, education, health, social services, the not-for-profit sector, representatives of our demographic communities locally, to implement an integrated service delivery model that better serves the human needs from birth to death, that seeks first to do no harm, that operates under a public health education model, and operates mainly in the pre-criminal space. We also have to break down the silos between our different institutions, between police, courts, and corrections, between the justice system, social services, health, and education. We have a new Police Service Act in Ontario that legally requires us to do these things. We have excellent civil servants like Tony DeMonte, who's leading the work here in the nation's capital. This is a game-changing opportunity to make true investments for true change. We need to reform and reinvest. The majority of people in the justice system are there not for crimes, but for mental health and addictions. We don't have a policing and justice system. In fact, we have a public health and addictions problem. If we did this right, we could save hundreds of millions of dollars in every province. We could save hundreds of millions of dollars across this country. Misspent dollars in the justice system that could be reinvested in some way across the human services systems and into the not-for-profit sector. But we first need to do the work of planning, implementing, and evaluating and sustaining before we can move to that level. Scotland has one of the best and most well-developed such systems, well-documented, well-researched. I'm going to quote from Megan O'Neill, who's an expert on community policing at the University of Dundee in Scotland. Police forces need to take a more integrated approach in how they serve their communities. She said that in most European countries, policing isn't viewed primarily from a top-down law enforcement perspective, but rather as part of a bigger solution to social problems. It's not, there's a problem, send the police. It's, there's a problem, let's work together to find the right solution and services. She said policing is seen as a small part of a bigger set of actors in terms of addressing social issues. But O'Neill said advocates shouldn't underestimate the costs. What's missing from the current discussions is we can't just take money from policing and put it somewhere else, she said. The whole system needs to be very well resourced. This kind of work is expensive. There's an argument that savings will come later, but it will have to be an upfront cost. The key message is fund public services. Let me provide updates now on actual real changes, major changes underway right here in the Ottawa Police Services that are based under the priorities set by the Police Service Board itself. Advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion. Our recruiting and hiring efforts in the Ottawa Police Service, and my credit to CAO Letourneau and his amazing team, Superintendent Patterson, and their amazing recruiting and hiring team. Since the start of the year 2020, we have received 1,636 applications, which includes a 46% uptick in female applicants, as many as 63 new applications from members of our Indigenous and Aboriginal communities, and another 558 applicants who self-identify from Black, Middle Eastern, LGBTQ2S, Muslim, and other minority communities. We have done an overhaul of our coach officer program, including a full audit of the program, new selection and training criteria for our coach officers, as well as the requirement for myself or a command officer to meet with every one of our coach officers before they're assigned a recruit in order to reinforce our values and our priorities. We have done a significant investment in our member well-being and health, a priority of the board. This includes our ongoing work around workplace sexual violence and harassment. This week, we will be expanding our efforts in that area with our internal advisory group and our external advisory group. And I want to compliment and thank Acting Deputy Chief Joan McKenna and her core team who have been working hard, Chair, with yourself, Krista Ferraro, Daljeet Nerman, and the board in this very important joint initiative. We have secured the support of both of our collective bargaining agencies, and we are now attempting to secure the support of many of our external partners. Our ongoing fatigue management strategy, again, a joint process between the Ottawa Police Association and the Senior Officer Association. Many of our members have gone through the training, and we're moving on to phase 2 now. And this is an area, again, that can address many of the issues of racism over policing, the ability for officers to de-escalate and to perform at a higher level in crisis situations. The modernization of the Ottawa Police Service is another priority imposed by the board. We continue to advance our reorganization of the Ottawa Police Service. We're building out the Respect, Values, and Inclusion Directorate while preparing for the next phase of work, which will be announced at the July board meeting. We're in the process of completing the hiring and onboarding of a chief financial officer, the hiring of a new chief information officer, and an equity, diversity, and inclusion specialist. I want to advise the board that we have significantly increased the level of external applications from members across this country, community members, who want to join the Ottawa Police Service, who want to be part of the mission of change, and who are bringing their skills and passions to bear on policing in this city. And last but not least, the board's priority of investing in neighborhood policing, specifically community policing advancement. In May 2020, we kept our promise. Credit to Deputy Chief. We deployed another neighborhood resource team, this one in the Bywood Market Centertown neighborhood. On June 5th, 2020, a member of the public alerted one of our new NRT members to an incident where a man was seen brandishing a firearm on Rideau Street. The NRT officer and other uniformed frontline officers responded immediately to the incident. They apprehended the suspect and seized a fully loaded crime gun. In the same week, another member of the NRT, Constable James Irving, attended a call for a man with severe mental health issues outside of one of our downtown shelters. The following letter was sent to me about the incident. This man is known to be extremely volatile and violent and is banned from all the shelters. He was covered in his own feces. Constable Irving approached the shelter and asked if they could make an exception long enough to allow the man to have a shower. The shelter agreed. The whole time your officers stayed close, allowing the staff to do their jobs, but ensuring they were safe. Your officers could have easily turned a blind eye, requested transport for him, or told him simply to move on, but they didn't. Instead, they took action to allow him to gain back some level of dignity. I watched your officers show extreme patience and compassion towards this man, and unfortunately, there was no one around to watch their actions or whip out their phones to video it. I want you to know that your officers' actions today were human and inspiring. They probably don't even realize the impact they had on this gentleman or on myself, who just happened to stumble across their act of compassion and kindness. Now, I note there are a number of other letters of recognition and appreciation in agenda item number 6 on this board report that represent but a small sample of the professional, ethical, compassionate service provided by Ottawa Police Service members over the past month. The current crises, opioids, COVID-19, systemic racism, they must all be viewed at this time as an opportunity to re-envision policing and all other democratic institutions. These crises have pushed police services into considering and implementing changes that have long been advocated for and very much needed. This is an opportunity not to return to normal, but to think and rethink practices and policing to create a better than normal, a truly new normal, where all members of society are treated equally, equitably, in an inclusive and humane and compassionate manner, where all members of police services see themselves as a part of community, delivering absolutely vital and needed core services to every member of the community, where they feel respected for what they do every day in difficult, dynamic circumstances. Thank you very much, Chair. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chief. I think you've covered an awful lot of topics, and I think especially for Member Nerman and Member Mann, they'll recall back to a time when the board identified that change was happening and that change was needed. And we made the decision to go right across the country to identify someone who we felt could best manage and bring that change to the OPS. And that's why we selected you. And I think your actions to date have rewarded us. And you certainly have identified the board priorities that you've launched into, and just how difficult it is to bring this much change in a relatively short period of time as you're doing. But I think you know, and I'll repeat it, you and your team certainly have the support of the board and the actions that you're taking. I specifically want to highlight a comment you made. You mentioned that there had been 1,636 new applications and that there was a 46% increase in women applying. And the board identified some time ago that we had issues, that there were issues with respect to getting a service that reflected the citizens that it served and representing the city of Ottawa. And so we had, and we worked very closely with the OPS staff to identify where there were barriers and what could be done to knock those barriers down. And I think that I'm personally very, very happy to see these numbers coming in now, because often you get a sense that you're trying to make change happen, but it just doesn't seem to be happening. And what you've brought to us today is dramatic evidence of those meetings we had and the outcome of those meetings, working with the staff to identify and to knock down barriers. And of course, we as a board know that it's not just good enough, and you certainly have raised this point many times. It's not just good enough to bring new members in. It's not just good enough to bring diversity in. We have to have a welcoming environment to retain them. And that is a work in progress, and it's something the board acknowledges. And we're certainly there to make sure that that's what happens next. Is not only have we brought these new people in who are the future of our service, but we're providing a welcoming and good environment that they can flourish in. And so I really want to thank you. And also I should mention, with respect to the hiring, I know that a lot of this has happened. The recruitment team has been going out on weekends and in the evenings to meet up with communities and working with social media and making sure that I know I see Sergeant Maria Keane on social media all the time. So I want to ask you to on behalf of the board, to reach out to all of these people and say how much we appreciate their hard work and the great results that they're bringing in now.
Thank you, Chair. Will do.
So I'd like to turn over to other board members and ask if you have questions or comments on the chief's comments, if you could step forward virtually. Ms. Daljeet, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Chief, for, as always, a very comprehensive round of the information, and I will say a mini encyclopedia. Just a brief thing, we have received so many applications, and about more than 45 to 50% are the diverse communities who are applying. Very encouraging, and thanks to you and the entire hiring team. But I recall there was a brief pause on that. Will that be affecting these applications also, or this is not a part of that?
Thank you, Member Neerman. And I'll call on CAO Letourneau to add additional comments. Of course, any delay in a recruiting and hiring process, regardless of whether it's policing, but in any institution, organization, private or public sector, puts a risk. The type of people we're trying to attract, the quality of their education, the depth of their lived experience, the diversity that they bring in their own persona, their experience in volunteerism, previous work experience, often in the private sector, sometimes in our military, in other related services, corrections, bylaw, social services. These are people that have options. We're trying to recruit the best of the best. And so clearly any delay in securing their hiring means that they could be a risk to be recruited and hired into another police agency, and in many cases into other public sector institutions or private institutions. So we're competing in a highly, we're in a highly competitive landscape. The other risk for us is there are limited spaces, although we've been able to secure space at the Ontario Police College, those spaces can be filled up in a hurry. So it's a very fragile ecosystem that allows us not just to hire, but to train and then deploy our members. And so we have to be managed that on an ongoing basis. And we also are competing now against a very negative period in policing. And we have to be mindful that those that may have applied a month ago, 3 months ago, given the current context, may be rethinking their choice. And why we want people to join with a very clear-headed understanding of the good and the challenge that will be involved, we need to be able to maintain momentum around recruiting and hiring in the organization. We need to be able to maintain that momentum by demonstrating the willingness and the ability to implement change, but to also bring in fresh new perspectives. I'll turn things over very briefly to the CAO, but there was a recent article in CBC where a young Black man was quoted, and he was asked very specifically, why would you want to join policing, particularly the Ottawa Police Service, given what's happened recently in the city and around the world? And his answer was very clear. It's the same reason why I have stayed in policing for my 3 decades, because he wants to make a change, because he believes he can make a change, because he sees the need for change. He wants to be part of the solution, not just somebody who complains about the problem. And I believe the vast majority of the people who've applied to be a member of this police service, and the vast majority of the members of this police service, have that in their heart and their soul as well. I want to ask CAO Letourneau to provide other comments and insights to your question.
Thank you, Chief. I'm actually not sure what I can add. That was a pretty good answer. What I can say is that we have hired 48 new recruits so far this year. The plan for the hiring plan for the year was 141. We have a temporary pause in place at the moment, and that's I think I'd like to leave it there.
Thank you, Judge. Member Nerman, I will guarantee, no matter what the size of the envelope, no matter what the conditions we face, we have a legislative responsibility to continue to hire so that we can be as reflective as possible of the demographics of the city of Ottawa and the values of the people of Ottawa. Regardless of the circumstances, we're committed to that legislative responsibility. Equally importantly, it's the priority of the board. And no matter what changes, that priority won't change. And until it changes, we will focus on meeting that as best as we possibly can.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you very much, Chief. Member Nerman, does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Caroline, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Acting Chair. Chief Slowly, one of the frustrations that many people have, talking about members of the public and with the police service and with the police board, is the fact that police officers who are accused of wrongdoing are suspended with pay. And we do not have the ability to change that. That lies with the province. The Premier of Ontario was asked today about this and what it would take in order to take a look at changing some of the legislation to permit police forces, police services to suspend officers without pay. The Premier said he would be willing to sit down with the chiefs of police, who he admits are the experts in this, and discuss it. Would you be willing to sit down with the Premier to discuss this? And do you think it's a good idea?
Thank you. First of all, I can tell you that the police chiefs in Ontario have had that conversation going back for decades and going back several different governments. Regardless of the political stripe, it is an ongoing challenge in policing. And so the short answer is yes. I am a member of the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. I have been in regular contact with Chief Paul Pedersen, who's the current president, as well as the staff of the OACP. And there have been a number of discussions around increasing police accountability, transparency, efficiency, effectiveness. And this is one of those discussions that has been an ongoing dialogue. I am not surprised that the Premier has made that statement. I am very aware of his willingness to continue to advance progressive legislation, as well as the efforts of the ministers of the Solicitor General and the Attorney General's office to continue to advance similar topics. And if there is a renewed opportunity to come back to the table on this or any other accountability topic, I will certainly be there to participate as a member of the Ottawa Police Service and to support the actions of the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. Right now, the legislation does not allow us to do that. And until the legislation changes, I think it's also important for you as a board member and for the members of the public listening and watching to this program, irrespective of any legislative change that may come in the future, we still have a responsibility to use the full range of discipline tools to allow us to change behavior, to change thinking and decisions that go into behavior, and to change the systems that influence thinking, decisions, and behavior. And so I will not simply wait for a change in legislation. My command team and I are already applying in the fullest sense, a sense of coaching, development, training, and yes, discipline, mediation, intervention, restoration, rehabilitation, in order to change thinking, change decisions, change behavior, even before we need to come to a decision around whether or not to suspend or separate an officer from the organization. So that is my commitment, that is the service's commitment, to continue to advance for progressive legislation, regardless of progressive legislation, to continue to advance for a progressive process across all of our HR systems to make sure we bring in the right people, keep them healthy and well and safe, allow them to make the best decisions on behalf of the public and on behalf of the service, and to avoid as much as possible the need for any formal discipline or termination.
Thank you, Chief, for that. I'm just wondering if there's something you can say to the public to address this issue of the number of police officers we have who are suspended with pay currently, and do we have a figure of how many are in that situation right now?
That's a good question. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. And more importantly than the exact numbers, I think it would be important to provide the board and therefore the members of the public with context to see whether or not the circumstances here in Ottawa are better, worse, or on average. Irrespective of where we are in terms of benchmarking, as I said earlier on, our goal is to continuously improve. We're never going to be able to eliminate the problems that come with the human condition, nor as an organization at the size and complexity that we are, going to be able to create perfect systems to prevent any act of misconduct or any act of misconduct or criminality that could be on scale where we need to suspend officers or terminate officers. But we are focused on trying to continuously improve. So if it's an inquiry that you're putting forward, I can commit to coming back to the board to answer that question more fully, and particularly within context of benchmarking to the ability that data allows for us to do that.
Good. Thank you so much, Chief. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And Caroline, I think that following up on the Chief's comment, I will take it that this is an inquiry from you so that we can expect a more fulsome answer from the Chief going forward. And I think it is important you raise a really important issue, and I appreciate all of the Chief's background on it, but for members of the public, this is that grain of sand that's caught in their sandal that it won't go away. Yep. And we really need to help the public understand that this is frustrating on many levels. But, yes. So I think if you agree, we'll make this an official inquiry and expect an answer at a forthcoming meeting.
I would do that. I will officially do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it to other members of the board now for questions for the Chief or comments on the Chief's comments.
Hi, Chair Smallwood, this is Robert.
Hi, Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. Just a quick comment. Member Nerman asked a question that concerns me as well with regards to the pause, and you answered it very well. And I just want to thank you for your always uplifting and very positive message. And I look forward to working with you on making your messages come to reality, because I think what you're saying is really touching a lot of people in the right way. And now it's more of just making sure that these things come to fruition. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Robert. Do we have any other questions for the Chief? If not, is this item received?
Received.
And no dissents? I'm not hearing any dissents. Okay, no. The next item on the agenda is item number 2, recommendations for addressing systemic racism and discrimination and bias and creating a more equitable and inclusive Ottawa Police Service. This motion was brought forward by Member Nerman, and we have some councillors who would like to speak to that. And so I'll ask, I guess maybe what we could do is I'll ask Member Nerman to read the full motion. It's an amended motion. I'll ask Member Nerman to read that, and then we'll go to the delegations after.
Thank you, Acting Chair Smallwood. I just want to make sure, is Mayor Watson attending the meeting today? Because I have to address the motion.
You know, he is not, he sent his regrets. He's not able to attend this meeting this evening.
Okay. So thank you, Acting Chair Smallwood. Before I read this motion, I would like to address the board and the other service and members. Do I have a permission to go ahead?
Yes, you do.
Thank you. Acting Chair Smallwood, fellow board members, Chief Slowly, all members of the Ottawa Police Service, and members of the public. I want to thank you again for giving this important issue your time and attention today. Over the last month, I have received a great deal of feedback on this motion I brought forward for discussion, and I would like to thank all of my board colleagues and the many other individuals, counselors, members of the OPS, my former professors, community leaders, and Ottawa residents for their contributions. It strengthens my resolve to see so many from every walk of life join with me in this. You will note that I have added fifth recommendation to the motion that is designed to formally link the efforts of the board and the Ottawa Police Service with the city's anti-racism secretariat and the new role given to Councillor Russell King as the liaison for anti-racism and ethnocultural relations. I believe that this strengthens the entire motion and ensure that the OPS considers the leading anti-racism practices identified by the Secretariat, while at the same time reducing any duplication of efforts. I thank Councillor King for his support and willingness to work on this important issue with the service and the board. I am also very alive to the frustration, anger, and sadness in our community right now around racism and policing. And I know that for very real and valid reasons, that those emotions are being felt very strongly in the Black and Indigenous communities. I strongly believe that racism and hate that impacts any community impacts every community. Today in Ottawa, we continue to struggle with hate towards Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters, mistrust and intolerance towards the Indigenous people of Canada, and intolerance towards our LGBTQ community. And sadly, during this pandemic, we have seen the rise of hate and racism towards members of our Asian communities. The language of the motion is therefore meant to embody the sincerest sense of equity and inclusion, where equity for all is what we are striving to achieve, understanding that no one is truly free, no one is truly able to achieve their full potential with sense of respect and dignity for who they are, unless their neighbors are free to do as well. Nelson Mandela often referred to this concept as rainbow jurisprudence as he transformed life in South Africa for both Black and white citizens. And so again, I do want to highlight the very legitimate and acute concerns of our Black and Indigenous communities, given what is happening in Canadian communities and around the world. But I also want to be sensitive to the experiences of racism and discrimination for many other individuals in our community, both historically and in the present day. I believe that this issue needs to be addressed as a whole, no matter how uncomfortable it may be for us as individuals or as an organization. In the words of our Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Justin Trudeau, and I quote, "Systematic racism is real, unconscious bias is real, and they happen here in Canada." I also want to thank and acknowledge Mayor Watson for his leadership in advancing anti-racism efforts across the city of Ottawa and by extension to Ottawa Police Service. How he and the entire City Council have acted to address this issue will reflect well in their legacy of service to the city and all of its residents. We now need to work on building this and strengthening our trust among the membership and communities we are serving. There is so much pain and distress to overcome. And how do we build accountability into the system so that we can have confidence that the right things are being done for the right reasons? So these have to be a whole of community decision, but it must be ensured that the voices and experiences of the communities, those have been marginalized historically, are heard. So the Black, Indigenous, women, and LGBTQ communities. The events here in Ottawa and around the world in the last few weeks continue to demonstrate the need for real action to combat racism, but also the urgency to act now. This motion announces to our city that the Ottawa Police Service recognizes that we are not perfect, but that we are working to make ourselves a better organization than we were yesterday. It makes it clear that we will never stop striving to be better for all of the citizens of Ottawa. Lastly, I, along with my fellow board members, look forward to be working with the chief by representing the community interest in policing to make sure that we take the right steps to address racism for all of our residents alike. I will be reading the motion now. Whereas Article Sub 1 of the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination defines racism as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Whereas subsection sub 2 of the Ontario Human Rights Code states, every person who is an employee has a right of freedom from harassment in the workplace by the employer or agent of the employer or by another employee because of race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, age, record of offenses, marital status, family status, or disability. Whereas the board policy number CR16, Human Rights and Racial Profiling, states that the purpose of this policy is to state the board's commitment to policing that respects and adheres to the principles contained in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom and the Ontario Human Rights Code, and to set out the board's expectation with regard to respecting human rights in the delivery of police services. Whereas, since the introduction of the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan, Chief Slowly and the Ottawa Police Service have taken a further step of creating the Directorate of Respect, Values and Inclusion, led by a superintendent, to strengthen the ability of the service to advance the 2020 goals and organizational culture more broadly. In partnership with the Ottawa Police Services Board, the Ottawa Police Service has launched a special committee to address sexual violence and harassment in the workplace. And whereas the Ottawa Police Services Board and Ottawa Police Service have a demonstrated commitment to promoting the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in continuing to build a workforce that is reflective of all the communities and neighborhood it serves. and based on a review of the work that has been completed and now planned, and to ensure there is no gap in activities addressing systematic racism and bias, which requires overt and sustained attention. Therefore, be it resolved that the Chief of Police be directed to consider the following set of recommendations and report back to the board through regular updates on EDI action plan. So the first recommendation is the efforts of the Ottawa Police Service to address this culture and structural inequalities should be a whole of organization initiative that is inclusive of all members, both women and men, Black, Indigenous, and LGBTQ, civilian, and sworn. And further, the approach to this work must demonstrate an understanding and appreciation of the unique contribution that every member makes in support of a safe, healthy, and inclusive city of Ottawa, and their equally critical roles in creating a more equitable and resilient culture within the Ottawa Police Service. Second, redesign the long-standing structures and systems that exist within the Ottawa Police Service to ensure they are more equitable and inclusive for all members by leveraging the Ottawa Police Services Board, the Community Equity Council, key community stakeholders, and all members. Third, task the new Respect, Value, and Inclusion Directorate to track incidents of discrimination and bias within the Ottawa Police Service that are not currently accounted for through our formal complaint systems. A system to identify, track, and report on these incidents should be developed or comprehensively heightened in partnership with the Ottawa Police Services Board, Community Equity Council, and other key stakeholders, with results being reported to the Ottawa Police Services Board through regular updates on the EDI action plan. Fourth, the Ottawa Police Service racial profiling policy should be reviewed to ensure that it is current and reflective of leading practices. The policy should also be evaluated to ensure that the systems and supports are in place or in the alternative strengthened for members and supervisors to identify, report, and intervene in a timely and constructive manner with incidents of concern. And my final and the fifth recommendation is that the Ottawa Police Service establish a partnership with the City of Ottawa Anti-Racism Secretariat to ensure that it considers leading practices to address racism, reduces duplication of efforts, and develops an inventory of approaches that can be utilized across all city departments and programs. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Smallwood.
Thank you very much, Member Nerman. I think, as we all know, this topic is so important, so timely, and your motion is right on the mark in terms of what the chief is doing and trying to do, and it shows how much the board is supportive of his activities, and just how the public generally is seized with the importance of this issue and the importance to bring this change to the service and indeed to the wider city. I know Councillor King had some presentation or comments on the motion, so I'll ask him to give us his thoughts now, if that's possible. Councillor King.
Thank you, Acting Chair Smallwood. I really do appreciate taking the time to be before you today to speak to this motion, because too many people in Ottawa experience high levels of racism and injustice. And it is very important that we take continued steps to ensure that the human rights and dignity of all people are protected. Therefore, I am completely supportive of Member Nerman's motion to address systemic racism, discrimination, and bias in order to create a more equitable and inclusive Ottawa Police Service. His motion calls for the redesign of long-standing structures and systems that exist within the OPS to ensure that they are more equitable and inclusive. I think that we all must stand in solidarity and recognize that we all have a role to play in addressing and eliminating racism and humanizing, as the chief said in his verbal report, all interactions with our community members. As a result, I do support the OPS in establishing a partnership with the City of Ottawa's new anti-racism secretariat to ensure that the police service considers leading practices to address systemic racism. Systemic racism is ultimately the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of the color of their skin, culture, or ethnic origin. And we're seeing people pushing back because they are being impacted by systemic racism. This is definitely a consequential moment in our history as people ask for meaningful transformation of their police services, meaningful reform of the police services, and basically real input into that process. That's one of the reasons why I had introduced an inquiry at City Council just recently to ensure that the public explores the mechanisms around providing input to around police reform, though we must acknowledge that we have the Police Services Board and we have multiple processes, including the Community Well-Being Plan, that are in place that will allow people to provide input. But people definitely want to see meaningful change. And we know that while that might not be applicable in terms of financing mechanisms and legislative change as the chief laid out in his verbal update, we know that that can be achieved through investment in public services. So that's one of the reasons why I circulated a quite extensive letter. I know that people might not have had the chance to reflect over it, but the reality is that the letter really outlines an approach that will take time, but is something that we seriously have to give consideration to. And it really does focus on the idea that we work together, the board, the council, to invest in areas where we have the jurisdiction to do so, that being social services, and that we make a call to ensure that the board and council works together to advocate for greater investments in community services that would really ensure that we are not dependent on traditional policing models of enforcement, but that we are meaningfully investing in communities, meaningfully investing in our youth through potentially a youth strategy, meaningfully investing in our communities through an expanded Building Better Revitalized Neighborhood program that is more permanent and is applicable to more areas of the city. It's absolutely important, as the chief had noted in his verbal statement, that we look at more progressive policing models like the Glasgow model, the Scottish model that he was talking about, where communities work hand in hand with economic development, employment opportunities, ensuring that there's proper investments in youth programming across the board. And so what I think people are saying is that they want to see more equity. They want to see us fight systemic racism through investments, and that we need to find comprehensive and take a comprehensive approach to that to ensure real meaningful change that happens in a more quick way. So I want to say that I do support this motion. I do support the view that we must address systemic racism, and that should not just be contained, obviously, to OPS operations, but it must also involve wider investments and a call for wider investments from all of us, from our senior levels of government, so that we see meaningful investments in communities so that they are able to have greater quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor King. I really appreciate your comments, and I think that there is a path forward that is going to see a partnership with the the Anti-Racism Secretariat, which you head, and the OPS and the OPSB. And I think that the strength of the organizations coming together at this time can bring about meaningful change. I would also note that you mentioned about the Glasgow model, which actually came to Canada as the hub model. It's certainly worth listening to Karen McCloskey, who is the genius behind that. But we do have, we did implement a model in Ottawa called the Merit Table, which sought to do just that in terms of bringing together and acknowledging that the police are but one player at the table. I see that Member Nerman has a question for you. So Member Nerman, do you have a question for?
No, it's not a question, just a note of thanks to Councillor King. Thanks for your support, Councillor, and I earnestly look forward to be working along with all the board colleagues on this sensitive issue, taking forward and making our Ottawa even better. Thank you. Thanks for your support.
Thank you very much, Member Nerman. Are there other questions from other board members for Councillor King? Bev Johnson, you have a question, please?
I just have a brief comment, and really it's just to thank Member Nerman and Councillor King for their work in this very important area and all that they're doing. And I guess I have a question as well, and this may be for Chief Slowly, is, you know, is the Ottawa Police Services officers and members educated on this important issue of implicit bias and racism?
Chair, would you like me to respond?
Yes,
or?
please, Chief.
Thank you.
And I know, Chief, you had a question as well, but I'll save that till after then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let you answer this one first.
Appreciate the question. Again, I think it'd be, I wouldn't want to encourage you to make it into an inquiry, but I think it'd be worthwhile for the board and through the board to the public to understand the full level of training that we do. There is an inquiry around use of force training, and it might be worthwhile to couple that with what training we do around anti-racism, managing personal biases, because they are sort of a hand-in-glove exercise. I can tell you that the Ottawa Police Service in its history has proven to be one of the most progressive and effective at using training and attempting training that hasn't been done either at all or on scale in an organization of this size. I recently requested from Superintendent Patterson a full list of the most recent training over the last decade. And quite frankly, I shouldn't say I was amazed, but it certainly validated my sense that literally every year for the past 7 to 10 years, there has been a new training course in addition to existing training that we've applied to our frontline officers. And certainly in the last month, we've gone looking internationally for best practices around training that relates specifically to the area that you're talking about, that Councillor King has been talking about, and that Member Nerman's motion speaks to. So it is an ongoing investment. I will say, though, that training in of itself has proven to be relatively effective, but not substantially effective to address the type of individual thinking, decision-making, behavior change, and equally, maybe more importantly, systemic types of issues that we've been talking about. So while it's an important area of exploration and investment, in of itself, it is not substantial enough to address the type of change we need. So I'd be happy to provide more information later on, but hopefully that answers your immediate question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Chief Slowly, you had a question or a comment for Councillor King.
Really just a quick comment. First for Member Nerman, thank you very much for your articulate and passionate motion. You have my full commitment, not just to the letter, but more importantly to the spirit of what you've put before us. And we're looking forward to working with you and the board and community stakeholders and bringing that to life. Much of that work is already underway, in some cases substantially underway. And again, we look forward to the opportunity to update the board on some of those efforts in the near future. And to Councillor King, you and I have had a short relationship, but quite dynamic one. I've appreciated getting a tour of your writing, meeting with some of your community stakeholders, listening to your own history, personal and professional, as well as sharing ideas around how we could go together and with other city agents and stakeholders to procure significant amounts of money provincially and federally to advance what you're doing. We've talked about how we can bring our efforts around implementing our EDI action plan in line with your new role at the city. And I'm looking forward to trying to bring to life the term partnership that was described in Member Nerman's motion into something very tangible, very practicable, and very accessible for not just our own members, but community members across the city. So thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Chief. Member Nerman, I see you have your, you had a question or comment?
Just a comment. Thank you, Chief. In fact, your support and your words means a lot, because this is the real motivation. The real doer, I will say, is you and the entire OPS force. We are just giving one of the direction. So I earnestly look forward to be working with you on this sensitive topic, which is very close to my heart. And I look forward to be working with you more closely in the coming days and weeks. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, as does the Ottawa Police Service, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Member Nerman. Thank you very much, Chief. Were there any other comments or questions from any of the other board members?
And I don't know if you would permit me, Acting Chair, to just quickly respond to the Chief.
Sure, of course.
Thank you. I do appreciate the work that the Chief is doing, and also the conversations that we had, especially around a unified funding request by council and by others across our community to the federal government to support social service funding for the city, which would look at enhanced use strategy, ideally bolstering funding for social programming directed to community resource centers in marginalized neighborhoods, or community prevention, crime prevention programming, and additional investments in after-school programs. So what I outlined in that letter that I provided to the board was really a blueprint, a starting point, I would hope, so that we can build this relationship together to really undertake a unified funding request that I think would be responsive to what people in our communities are telling us, that they want transformation. And part of that transformation really does involve ensuring that we have appropriate investments in communities, appropriate investments in social services. And I'm very gratified that I'm able to work with our Chief of Police on these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Okay, we have another presentation from Councillor Kavanagh. Councillor Kavanagh, if you'd like to begin your comments.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I want to thank Member Nerman for his motion, and also to my colleague Councillor King for being here and adding his support. I'm coming here today as the council liaison on women and gender equity, which ties in very strongly with what is happening today in terms of looking at systemic racism. It also includes sexism. And when we talk about racialized women, they face a double whammy in terms of discrimination and comments. And this is something that we have to fight back on. I appreciate the comments of the Chief on working on these issues. It's going to take a lot of effort. And I hope that you'll work with City Council on this, because we all feel very strongly of the concerns with recent comments that we've heard. All the kinds of comments, the comments that we are hearing don't reflect just one individual. It affects an entire race. It affects an entire gender. The power of those comments are far-reaching when people use certain language. And I think we can't forget that. And we have to remember that at all times. I want to work with you on this, on improving the system, because we've seen that there are concerns. They're not just concerns with the public, but as you've said, they're concerns within the organization itself and how members conduct themselves. So we need to work together to make sure that that is resolved as well as how the public are treated, which is obviously at the forefront these days. So I want to thank you for bringing this motion forward, Member Nerman, and just the added reminder of the concern for gender equity as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kavanagh. Member Nerman, you wish to make a comment?
Thank you, and I wish to thanks for Councillor Kavanagh for coming and extending your support. It means a lot to us as a board, and definitely going forward, I will be discussing with all the respective all the board members at how we can work together with your issues as well. And of course, you have rightly said the issues which you have brought forward are equally important and plugs into the systematic racism and bias. So thanks once again, and I look forward to be working with you as well.
Thank you very much, Member Nerman. Chief, you have a question for or comment for the councillor?
Thank you, Chair. Just learning how to raise my hand on Zoom, but again, just wanted to respond. First of all, I want to thank Councillor Kavanagh. Again, I had the opportunity to do a tour of her neighborhood. She was very passionate, very knowledgeable about local needs, and very measured but determined in making sure I understood the need to provide services to the most marginalized and often disenfranchised, often racialized communities in the nation's capital. I reached out to her recently to seek her advice and wise counsel on the issues of gender equity, violence against women, and particularly the work, Chair, that you and I are undertaking around advancing a strategy to reduce the impact of workplace sexual violence and sexual harassment. And she was very generous in her time and her advice, and equally passionate around the topic. Again, I'm hoping that we'll continue to be able to tap into her formally or informally on this very important subject. And I absolutely recognize the intersectionality between race and gender. And it's my intention that whether we tackle an issue of racism or an issue of sexism or an issue of homophobia, that a rising tide should raise all the boats in the harbor. That wherever we decide to put our efforts to create more equity and inclusion, it should affect every member who's facing any service member who's facing any inequity and exclusion, and any community member who's facing any inequity or exclusion. And that should be the goal of every one of our efforts inside the Ottawa Police Service, to address all the different issues, whether we're pointing at one area or doing a more broad approach. And so I'm glad she raised that issue of intersectionality. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from other members of the board?
Yes, hi, Chair Sandy. I just wanted to, just a quick comment. I want to thank Member Nerman for putting forward such a thoughtful and important motion. Member Nerman was formulating this motion before the recent events that took place in the United States. This speaks to his understanding of the issue before it was launched into the public spotlight. I'm happy to see such an inclusive motion for all members of the OPS. And just to echo what the chief just said, it sets to lift everyone up and empower all members of the OPS to be the best they can be. And once again, I want to thank Member Nerman for putting this forward.
Thank you very much, Member Sweda. Are there any other comments or questions from the board members? Well, I wanted to thank you very much, Councillor Kavanagh, for your questions and comments and reflection on this issue. As I think everybody's mentioned, this is extremely important, and I think we're finally getting some traction on it. Is the motion carried as amended?
Carried.
Yes, carried.
Are there any dissents? Not hearing any. I'll move on now to item number 4 on the agenda, which is
Acting Chair Smallwood, I have a small note of thanks on the carrying of this motion. Can I?
Of course.
Thank you, Acting Chair Smallwood. I want to thank you and all of my board colleagues for their support of this motion, focus on addressing the systematic racism and structural barriers that continue to exist within the OPS and our community. I am also thankful to Chief Slowly for his indulgence and thoughts surrounding this motion, and also my former professors, various city councillors who stepped up to provide their inputs on this critical issue, work with OPS and our board, colleagues in the legal profession, community leaders and members of the OPS for their feedback and support. I am truly proud of your collective leadership and courage to name the issue and address it head on. As you all know, this is an issue that I am personally passionate about and committed to addressing. Based on my many conversations I had in developing this motion and in reflecting on my own lived experience and my reaction to a series of events, both locally and internationally, it was important for me that we took action. Collectively, we must ensure that the Ottawa Police Services continues to be a leader in advancing EDI and the cultural and structural changes required to serve our increasingly diverse community in a manner that respects human rights and the dignity and the value of every resident. Through the board, I look forward to working with the chief and his team and with Councillor King and Councillor Kavanagh to ensure that beyond the words, this motion leads to a meaningful change that our members and the community can see and feel. I profoundly thank you all once again.
Thank you very much, Member Nerman. I think I speak on behalf of all the board members that we realize the importance of this motion to you and the enthusiasm with which you've attacked this and brought it forward, and make sure that I have no doubt that you will continue to work hard to make sure that this becomes more than just a series of words. So thank you very much for your efforts here.
Thank you.
I'm going to now go to item number 4 on the agenda, which is response to inquiry 12006, community outreach to prevent gender-based violence, particularly outreach to racialized women. So I know we have a delegation on this, and I think Councillor Kavanagh, did you wish to start with your presentation?
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Smallwood. I really appreciate members for bringing this forward, because this is, as I've mentioned already, the double whammy of racism and sexism together, and the concern. And with events in the last few days of comments that we've heard and allegations we've heard, I am very, very concerned about any comments against a woman, because those comments are slander to all women. We all feel it, and it's very, very concerning, and we cannot tolerate it. This is something that has to be dealt with, and I'm trusting that the chief will make this his top priority. So we have to work continuously on this issue. So I'm asking this, and it's not just what we experience just in our communities, it's everywhere. So I'm asking for this to be a priority on how we treat women, and particularly racialized women in our community. We know that this is probably the largest group that has a fear of police, and if it's based on realism, then that is a big concern. So this is something that I want to disappear, and that we have a police force that is welcoming to racialized women in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kavanagh. Is there anybody who would like to ask the councillor any questions or make any comments before we deal with the item before us? Chief Slowly, is that you looking to put your hand up?
Chair, you're starting to be able to figure me out here, which is kind of
That's
scary.
right.
I want to be able to provide some comment. Again, I need to be careful. There's two related ongoing matters that preclude me from speaking substantially further. And so if it could just suffice to say that I have reached out personally. My executive officer and my senior members have reached out personally to the affected member. I've had conversations with this person over the course of the weekend, and my team have picked up on offering practical supports to her and her family over the course of today. What I do want to do is make it very clear that the language used in the published recording is offensive, reprehensible, and unacceptable under any circumstance, directed to any person. And so I just want to be able to share that at this meeting at this time. Thank you, Chair.
I appreciate that, Chief. I think that's a very helpful comment and certainly one that's shared, I think, by everybody. Are there any other comments or questions on this item?
Could the Chair, it's Carol Ann.
Yes, Caroline.
I would I'm asking what some of the options are for the chief in reprimanding someone who is alleged to have used.
I'm sorry, Caroline. I'm not sure if the chief could understand you, but I couldn't.
Okay, I'm just asking. Just a sec. My question is, I'm wondering what some of the options for discipline are if the chief decides to go that route to deal with the alleged, the alleged or the language that was used. Can anyone interpret for me?
Chief, were you able to get the question?
No, I'm sorry, Chair. I haven't been able to listen to it.
Okay, Chief, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I'm just wondering what some of your options are if you were to move to discipline the alleged, the person who is alleged to have made those. What options are available?
I'll have to be more direct than before. There are ongoing matters before the courts and in other processes that will preclude me from answering that question directly. I don't mean to be obtuse, it's simply the requirement of law. If I could take your question with some permission, and please feel free to push back or correct. What would the police service do if a member of the police service was to use similar or the same language in any future case? Again, it would have to depend on the circumstances involved, the individual, their previous history. There'll be a number of factors, but nothing would change the level of reprehensibility around the terms used. It would be taken seriously. Again, as I've expressed in this board meeting and in previous board meetings, while I would look at the full extent of discipline available to me, I would have to look at the most appropriate approach to discipline in order to get to the best outcomes. One where there was direct support for the individuals who were victimized or most directly impacted by such conduct of a member. One that would look to be in the best way possible to restore or rehabilitate that member, assuming that the context didn't require a pursuit of some sort of suspension and or separation. And ultimately one that allowed the organization as a whole to ensure that the likelihood or instances of that type of conduct would be prevented in the future and the impact would be reduced in the future. I know that's very generic, but I need to be able to always be clear that every case is unique, and the need for us to be as restorative as possible to those victims directly affected, and the perpetrators and the organization of itself are considered in every final intervention and decision in these matters.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief. So if I don't hear any other questions or comments, that the Ottawa Police Services Board received this report for information. Is the item received?
Received.
Received.
Thank you very much. Is there any other business? Not hearing any. We're now, I'd look to our consideration of motion to move in camera that the Ottawa Police Service. Sorry, Caroline, were you speaking?
Sorry. No, my apologies.
Okay. That the Ottawa Police Services Board adjourn the public portion of its meeting to move in camera to discuss confidential items pertaining to legal, security, and personnel matters in accordance with Section 35, subsection 4B of the Police Services Act. The in-camera items include legal matter involving a named individual, candidate day briefing, personnel matter involving a named individual, and the legal matter involving a named individual. And with that, I'll move for adjournment. And our next meeting will be Monday, July 27th, 2020 at 4 p.m. So I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you, Member Norman, and I'd like to thank everybody for participating. And I'd like to thank members of the public who took the time to join us for this very important meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Acting Chair Smallwood, and thanks everyone for their support. Thank you.
Oops.